Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's HFTP ProLinks webinar, Staffing Global Survey Results. I am Brittany Brewster, along with Barbara Cimarero, and we are coordinating today's webinar. The topic of the survey is on the most significant issue affecting the industry now and in the foreseeable future, staffing. The survey was undertaken as a partnership between the Institute of Hospitality, International Center of Excellence in Tourism and Hospitality Education, and eHotelier. The survey was designed to better understand the future skill needs of the international hospitality industry. This comprehensive survey provides significant data that should help to better inform the training and education sectors of the industry, as well as provide insights into current industry thinking on professional development and the links to recruitment and retention. We are joined today by Matthew Stevens, Managing Director at eHotelier, and Professor Peter Jones, Academic Director at eHotelier. And at this time, I welcome you both and hand the webinar over.
Thank you very much, Brittany. And welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar. As Brittany mentioned, my name is Matthew Stevens. I'm the Managing Director at eHotelier, and I'll be facilitating the discussion today. I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Peter Jones, who's going to present the results of the Global Hospitality Industry Survey, as Brittany mentioned, focused on the impacts of the pandemic on our most valuable resource, our people. So we'll start off with an overview of the respondents to the survey before we present and interpret the results in the four key areas: the impact on the industry, recruitment and retention, the skills needs for the industry, and then we'll look at what this means for training and education in the future. Before we get started, as Brittany mentioned, the webinar is being recorded and we'll send a copy to everyone who's registered. You can use the module on your screen to send questions or comments. We'll have some time at the end when we look at key takeaways to also answer your questions. So please stick those questions in the chat. So to introduce my colleague, Professor Peter Jones, is a hospitality education and training professional. Peter's delivered projects including the unique multi-million-pound Edge Hotel School in the UK, as well as numerous national and international projects in hospitality education. Peter's the Academic Director at eHotelier, the global online portal for hospitality professionals, and he's also the chair of the Crumbs Project, which is a charity that provides hospitality professional training for adults with learning and mental health difficulties. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Nice to be here.
Great to see you again. And Peter, can you please start by maybe giving us an overview and a background and the purpose of the survey?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this was some of the things that we've been talking about for some considerable time, and we were trying to understand what the future needs of the industry will be on the basis of what was happening, certainly post-pandemic. So we realized that the pandemic was actually having a major impact on the industry overall, and what would be the longer term impacts of that? And I think what we've also found as we've been going through this research is that those in themselves and some of the insecurities surrounding us at the moment are all having quite a significant impact on the way the industry is having to behave, and that in turn will have a big impact in terms of the nature of the new professionals that the industry will need going forward.
So in terms of the survey itself, maybe if you can give us an overview of the respondents and where they came from.
Yeah, so we conducted the survey, which was online over a period of about 4 months altogether, using different routes. You've heard of the different people that we had involved, the different partners involved, and we used those partners to actually try and elicit the responses from the areas that they were most heavily represented in geographically. So HFTP, obviously, and you can see from there that we had over 800 usable responses to the survey. We had more, but not all were complete. So we had 800 usable responses, of which 15% came from North America. And you can see for yourself where the rest of them, where these individuals were located. So obviously one of the largest areas to respond was Europe. So we have an interesting mix now between the rest of the world, Europe and America, and actually in trying to identify whether there was any difference by geographical location, we didn't come up with any significant findings. The sense was that we have an international response now that is representative of the international industry.
So those partners, again, HFTP were a partner in delivering the survey. So we're very grateful to HFTP for your, and hopefully some of you joining the webinar today also responded to the survey. But also a number of partners in North America, including Cornell, responded and distributed the survey too. So in terms of the roles and the sectors of the industry that were represented, Peter, could you give us an overview, please?
Sure. So we'll just take the roles first. So we were targeting individuals that had executive role responsibilities within the industry, and therefore would be, if you like, more in the areas of the decision makers, especially in terms of recruitment, but also strategic decision makers, understanding what the industry shape and size might look like. The responses were 43% of the respondents identified themselves as CEOs, presidents, or directors. Then we looked, 43% were operational or specialists. So some in finance, some are operations managers, regional managers, and so on. And then we had, because we were looking as well for the impact on education and training, we also used a partner, eHotelier, who were able to access a number of people in education and training for us as well. So we had 22% of the responses were educators. Interestingly, again, we tried to identify, was there any significant difference in the responses between these types of groupings? And the answer again was no. No significant difference, marginal, but nothing significant. In terms of the industries that they were operating in, 49% of all of those respondents, obviously not education and training, were, so those senior executives and operational and specialist managers were in hotels, and the balance, the 29%, were in restaurants, caterers, cruise liners, or those types of associated industries that wouldn't describe themselves initially as hotels.
So normally when we do surveys, we find that there's differences between regions of the world, but it appears that the pandemic has affected everybody equally, and we're now facing the same challenges right around the world in all sectors of the industry. So
yes,
Peter,
that's correct.
Peter, in terms of size of businesses that the respondents represent, can you talk through the?
Yes, well, again, interesting to see. So what we have here is, as you can see, is the number representative proportions or percentages of the business sizes. The largest business size are 10 to 250. 46% of the respondents were running businesses of that size. And you'll obviously, the next one down, if you like, or up, 250 to 1,000, 23%, 17% only with 1,000 to 2,500 staff, the really bigger, much bigger international companies. Some quite small companies with less than 10 members of staff. So that's an interesting indicator of is the nature of the composition of the industry across the world. Certainly as far as Europe and the States are concerned, there is an accepted view that the majority of the hospitality industry are what are often referred to as SMEs, small and medium enterprises. And this reflects the views of SMEs in the same way as it reflects the views of the larger corporates as well. And that's particularly relevant and important because those form the majority of the operating businesses within the industry, those SMEs.
So moving on now to the actual results of the survey, but before we do, we've got a number of poll questions to pop up, which Barbara is going to help us with. So poll question 1, please have your say in our poll, and we'll provide the results at the end of each of these 4 chapters. So the pandemic has resulted in the hospitality industry undergoing the most significant changes in my lifetime. So this is your opportunity to say whether you agree, disagree, or neither. So Peter, at the outset of the pandemic, you wrote a paper forecasting what you predicted the impacts of the pandemic would have on the industry. How did your predictions compare to the reality, and what were some of those predictions?
Yes, interesting. The predictions that, I mean, the paper was called Hospitality in the Post-COVID World, and I was trying to look at what the impact of the pandemic would have, and therefore what the shape and size of the industry might be as we move forward into the future. I won't pretend that my middle name is Nostradamus, but I was quite surprised at just how accurate some of those areas were. In particular, consumer behavior changing, staff behavior changing, and in particular, things like the nature of the business model and the way that we've had to change and adapt the business models to become more resilient in the future than we were perhaps in the past. We are only really beginning to see the full impact of the pandemic now. Even though you might say, oh, well, you know, we're 18 months, we're 2 years beyond that. Yes, but there were so many interventions that took place during the period of the pandemic. And we're now beginning to see not just the impact of the pandemic, but what's happened globally since the pandemic. War, financial headwinds, looming recessions, all of which in many ways you can almost trace back to the pandemic and the world's response at the time.
So let's move on to the results now. Thank you very much for participating in the poll. We'll look at the results in a minute. Peter, in terms of the industry leaders' views, maybe we can step through each one of these findings.
Yeah, sure. And we'll do this fairly quickly, but the views of the industry leaders were definitely that the industry has been significantly impacted by COVID-19. There was no real discernible difference either between the size of the business or the geographical location in that. There was some small minor differences in the next point, which was the industry is likely to be smaller and leaner in the future. Even though there was a majority view that this would be the case, it wasn't as well supported a view as, for example, significantly impacted, the one above. What we're beginning to see now, though, is that the impact is to create a smaller and leaner industry. And certainly, if you just look, certainly as far as Europe's concerned, when I look at the professional press on a daily basis, I'm beginning to see that prediction coming true. In terms of closures, in terms of changing of operational systems, in terms of people actually scaling back the offer significantly for all of those sets of reasons, or some of the reasons that we'll come on to. And that leads on to the view that the business model needs to change. The business model pre-pandemic is not holding true post-pandemic. So the business model of its very nature has got to change. And we're beginning to see evidence of the nature of those changes. And I think the industry leaders' view was, yes, it does need to change. And obviously they're thinking about what are those changes we need to put in place in order to ensure our survival. Technology will definitely have an important role to play. And some of the commentary was around artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on. But I would argue that actually technology has a much more important role to play in terms of the customer interface. The whole contactless revolution. There are many restaurants and operations, certainly in Europe now, that won't accept cash anyway at all. But it's more important than that. When the business model changes, the technology has got to change to reflect the operational requirements of the business model. And it's going to be more complex, certainly as far as managing people is concerned. And so I think the technology is going to have a much more important role to play in terms of supporting the management in this changed business environment and the changed business model. This is a point that's come from a number of different sources, but there is a real commitment to sustainability and environmental change. I think the whole COP climate talks, the whole emphasis and the manifestation of the way climate change is impacting on people's daily lives is beginning to show really what the industry is, how the industry has got to respond to that. And they're beginning to, the consumers certainly, and the staff, especially younger staff, want to see in the industry have a real commitment to sustainability and how it's going to contribute to some of the UN sustainability goals, but also how is they going to try and reduce carbon footprints and so on in relation to climate change. And it's a bit of a self-evident truth, I suppose, but there was a view from the industry leaders that the current education and training systems are not fit for purpose. They're not adapting rapidly enough to be able to meet the changing needs of the industry. And I think there is an inherent view in there that came out in some of the comments, is that they're too slow in changing, and they tend to be based on the past rather than looking forward. So their offer, if you like, the education and training offer, is rather based on, well, this is what we needed then, and we carry on training to that, rather than this is what we'll need in 5 years' time, therefore we need to start to train to that. And it's that link that's missing there at the moment. And so education and training definitely needs to change quite rapidly, and they need to evolve new models of education and training to cope with the professional needs of the industry.
I think it's interesting that 22% of respondents were from the education industry, and 94% of respondents are saying it needs to change. So this isn't just something the industry is saying. This is also something the education sector within the industry is also saying.
That is one of the areas where there was a marginal difference when I isolated out the responses from education and training and the responses from industry, is that there was a view from education that they needed to change.
Right.
Now, of course, the issue there is that those as educators might say, yes, we recognize we need to change, but often they're trapped in huge regulatory and bureaucratic systems, which makes their ability to change quickly quite hard. But there is a recognition, as you say, both industry and education, of the need to change.
So we're in a time of massive change. And it seems, technology and education has to respond quickly to cope with that change too. So Barbara, maybe could you put the poll results up and we'll see how our respondees compared. Well, Peter, I think that's quite comprehensive, quite significant.
Yes, I think it's pretty much, in fact, and it mirrors very closely the sort of responses that we had the first time round. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. So moving now to recruitment and retention. And before we do, we've got another poll question for our audience. Peter, this has been a major issue for the industry for a long time. Why is it so much more significant now?
I think what's going on now is that we're beginning to face conflicting sets of pressures on staffing, and those things, whilst they've always been there, if you like, that the industry has either been seen as a transitory industry, it's something I do before I get a proper job, or it's something that I'm actually really committed to. But there's always been a reasonable pipeline. It might not have been always easy to recruit them, but there was a reasonable pipeline there of availability. So the supply side was reasonable, even though it might not have always wanted to come and work for us. What we're finding now, of course, is the supply side is reducing. So in the developed world, we have an aging population. Lots of people are falling out of the workforce. And we had the situation in certainly in the US and in Europe, and particularly in the UK, of what I think somebody coined the phrase, the Great Resign. People taking themselves out of the workforce with no real intention of putting themselves back into it again in the same way as they were before. So we've got a smaller accessible workforce coming through, and we have less people available to us because those that may have still been in the workforce have chosen to exit the workforce. So the economist's terms is, they're no longer economically active. They don't like being called economically active or otherwise. They might be very active doing other things. And part of this, I think, is that people's realization from the pandemic that there are more important things to their lives than just working. And I think that's been a huge catalyst in changing people's thinking about what do I want to achieve in my life, compared to before, we're rather on a little bit of what I would refer to as the Victorian industry treadmill, that, the only way you're ever going to succeed is you've got to join this particular thing and work at it for the next 45 years, get your gold watch and off you go. I mean, the whole attitude to employment, I think, and career is going through some really significant changes now, not the least of which is there are fewer people available.
And at the same time as demand comes back to the industry, the demand from customers is increasing. Their demands on service are starting to increase as well. That revenge travel is starting to stop, and their expectations are now increasing. And that's creating a gap between the supply of staff and the demand of consumers. So that's got to be putting a lot of pressure on operators. So let's have a look at the. Sorry, Peter.
I was just going to. Well, no, I was because we'll pick those points up as we go through.
For sure. So talking about the results of the survey, then, can you talk about the implications?
Yeah, I mean, I've already mentioned the issue about the losses to the profession. So a lot of people have exited the profession. You've also got to recognise, I think, that the new entrant pipeline is smaller than ideally we would like it to be, but that's also a demographic factor. There aren't that many people available to come into the workforce. So as an industry, we've got to be much more attractive to a smaller number of people in order to try and get that career aspirational pipeline working. In terms of the others, the people that may have formed part of our workforce, they're looking for a much better work-life balance. And that came up. That was one of the specific questions we asked. Do you think that people are now looking for a much more a better work-life balance? And there was an overwhelming response to the fact people believed that that was the case, especially amongst the younger workforce. So that leads to the issue about employment having to become much more of a negotiated partnership rather than a contract of employment. Before, it would have been, we're looking for these roles, 35, 40 hours a week. These are your contracted hours. This is the terms and conditions, off you go. To some extent, take it or leave it. Now that's completely different. And I just give you one example that I've mentioned to you before, Matthew, is this one of a colleague of mine who's a GM of a large hotel in the north of England. Pre-pandemic, he had a food and beverage workforce that, including his chef's brigades and so on, for his property of around about 40. Now he has a food and beverage workforce of 120. And that's because they all want to work flexibly. They mostly want part-time. He's always had a part-time provision anyway, but it's the part-time provision now that is becoming much more complex to try and manage, because people are saying, I'll come and work for you. I'd love to, but I'm only going to do it on Wednesday afternoon and Wednesday evening, and I can't do any other day of the week. So it's, whereas before, the operational manager might say, oh, look, we need an extra shift doing tomorrow. Can you come in? They might have said, oh, yeah, sure, not a problem. They're saying, no, sorry, that's my yoga day, or I go to meditation classes, or whatever it might happen to be. And they're not prepared to give up the elements of their life for their work. And that means you've got a much more complex position to try and actually negotiate. And that's where I talk about that need for negotiated partnership and the complexity of managing a much more flexible workforce. The issue is there as well, that we're not attracting those new entrants to replace those leaving. And we're not presenting ourselves, and I think there is a number of good reasons for that, but we're not presenting ourselves as attractive new entrants for that career aspirational side of it, because they're not necessarily looking for the career that we were offering before. They want a different work-life balance career. They don't necessarily all want to be food and beverage managers or general managers. They want to be something where they're making a contribution to society, to their business, and to their life. And negotiating those things and finding out how you can offer that to a potential employee is going to be really difficult.
So it sounds like the recruitment process is in the favor of the employee now.
Yeah, well, I think it's completely in favor of the employee now. And that puts greater costs on recruitment. And we may have to think about how we recruit people slightly differently. Agencies are doing very well at the moment, but they're not necessarily delivering the agency staff that are viable for the property. So you have a problem there.
Sure.
We know that the potential talent pipeline that could come through doesn't necessarily have the professional skills. So then it becomes more of the responsibility of the industry to provide those skill sets that the industry needs. And that comes to the point of what characteristics do we need to look for in people that we can then help to educate and train to develop the professional skill sets that we need. And that obviously leads to much greater investment in training and career development.
Sure. So before we move on to skills, I know there was a lot of detail in the attributes and the attitudes of people that employers are looking for during that recruitment process. But Barbara, maybe we can have a look at the results of the recruitment and retention poll before we move on to skills needs.
Whoa.
Wow. There you go.
Yes.
Yep. I don't think we need to say much more about that.
Nope.
I think everyone on the webinar agrees. That's great.
Yeah, good.
So let's move on to skills needs. We have another poll question, which Barbara can pop up now. So the question is, younger new entrants in the industry expect a better work-life balance in their careers. So now we're talking about that recruitment point, a little more detail, and what the expectations of particularly the younger generations are. So I think we all recognize that the millennials are different to the Gen X's, Gen Ys, and Gen Zs. So Gen Zs, I should say. Let's look at whether they are looking for a better work-life balance. But Peter, you mentioned the exodus or the great resign of talent and experience. I think experience is really hurting in that leadership and middle management and supervisory level.
Yeah.
So as new professionals enter the workforce, how are their expectations changing, particularly at that, you've talked about line staff and the frontline staff. How are expectations at a supervisory and a management level changing too?
Well, yes. And I think what's interesting there is that there is often, okay, so I have a supervisor who leaves, I've got a good member of line staff and say, okay, fine, well, perhaps, would you like to take on that role? Whether they're suitable for that role, whether they're actually adequately and appropriately prepared to take on the role is another matter often. And they tend to be thrown in because, my goodness me, I haven't got anybody to do this, supervise this shift. What am I going to do? So I think we have to rethink sometimes some of these things. I'm not against, in fact, I'm often very much in favor of pushing especially younger people into accepting responsibilities, providing there's an appropriate mentor and supervisor on hand to provide that coaching, guidance and advice. Where it never works and you lose them, of course, is if you just push them in there and then the manager just steps back and says, well, they'll either sink or swim. That's not the approach. What we've got to be is much more professional in supporting these new entrants into the industry and actually encouraging them to take responsibilities for themselves. And I think what we're beginning to look at is to say, well, what are the skill sets or the personal characteristics we need? Because if we've got those characteristics, then they're the people who are much more likely to be wanting to and able to take on those additional responsibilities. So it's a bit chicken and eggish, but it is about developing a culture, a supportive, nurturing culture that helps individuals. And in helping the individual, you're obviously helping the organization at the same time. But all these things are challenges. They're not one, it's not one I've got to deal with today. They're all there, and they're all there all the time. But I think it's more about developing an organizational culture which is mutually supportive as well. So they're not left on their own, but there is a team around them which supports it, but also the manager intervenes and provides that necessary coaching, facilitation, mentoring in order to allow them to move on. And to take more responsibility, which ultimately is what we want them to do.
For sure. So let's move on to the results of the skills needs. What did you see in the results in this area, Peter?
Well, this is interesting in the sense that the professional skills, you can split those out to some extent, in that if I'm looking for a chef, I need the chef to come reasonably well prepared. If I'm looking as an apprentice, that's a different matter. So I'm looking for some sets of professional skills for specific specialist roles. IT, finance, chefs are obvious ones. Where it varies from then on is when we're talking about the generic, more customer guest facing service skills. And what the industry is saying that they're looking for there is they want people who are good with people. And that we can see that when we look at the skills and the attributes of the individual. We need people who are good with people, people who like people, people who naturally would be hospitable, because that's where the guest service skills come in. It's about having that willingness and wanting to actually offer hospitality to strangers, because that's what our business is all about. And that, of course, relates to people skills. What I was also interested in is that financial skills, there's some issues there. They don't want people necessarily to be able to read a balance sheet. They want them to understand what a budget looks like and how the management reports can influence the way that I can better the organization. What's the information that the financial skills are telling me that tells me about the operation, and how can I use them to change the nature of the operation, but also backwards. So you need to be able to say, if I want to change this in the operation because I've got to, what are the implications of that in terms of my revenue and my costs? So that's where I think we're seeing changes, and that's where education and training needs to change. Why on earth we teach accounting 101 to some of these people, and we start with the basis of the balance sheet and the profit? I have no idea. It just defeats me. I mean, you ask the average general manager about a balance sheet, and they look at you and say, yeah, I know those. And that's about it.
Talk to my FC. But financial acumen is sounds like it's absolutely critical.
That's the issue. It's financial acumen, not the technique necessarily. It's actually understanding the way that the money flows work, and how you can change the nature of the operation to improve the money flow one way or the other.
So we've talked about technical skills. Let's move on to skills and personal characteristics. What were the results here?
Well, here you can see this is why it's so important that the people skills and those guest service, the customer facing, being hospitable matter so much. So communication skills, cooperation, part of a team, listening skills. We're often good at talking, but are we equally as good at actually listening, especially to the customer? Do we take note of the body language of the customer? It's not just listening, it's actually observation as well. So that's all part of the whole issue about communication. So those three, as you can see, in terms of people's ranking of those as being completely agreeing and then agreeing, are particularly relevant, because in those top three, they are by far and away what are considered to be the most important personal skills that individuals will bring to the business. Yes, they want them to be literate, they want them to be culturally aware, and so on. Interesting, I think that perhaps a slight misunderstanding in terms of delegation skills. If you're a member of a team, you're cooperating with others, often the delegation comes as an automatic byproduct of that. You don't think about it differently. Interesting analytical skills and numeracy. again, we're coming back to my same point about building financial skills. It's financial awareness, financial acumen. You don't necessarily have to be brilliantly numerous about understanding balance sheets, for example. So those things, I think it's those top three: communication, team building, cooperation, listening, and being literate to some extent, because that comes in communication. But those are much more important to the industry overall than the rest of them.
So we're going to move on to values next, but keeping those top three in mind, we move on to values. Do you think those three, that open communication, gives a manager a sense of trust in an individual? And how does that relate to these personal values?
Well, I think it does. And I think there is a very strong correlation between what we're looking for in terms of skills and the characteristics of the individual that we want to portray those skills. We want them to be honest, to be trustworthy, to have the right attitude, to have a sense of integrity about themselves and the nature of their business. So there's a very, very strong correlation between that. You could argue that there was quite a strong correlation actually between those top three skills and all of the personal characteristics, but particularly the issues about honesty, trust, attitude, and integrity. If I've got those and they can communicate well, and often people will be able to, they communicate their honesty, they communicate their trust, their whole behavior is about, I am a person you can trust, I'm being honest with you, I've got a positive attitude to what I'm doing, and you can trust my integrity. I'm not going to let you down. And I think those things are particularly relevant when we're, it's what are we really looking for? That's what we're, I mean, the next thing we could say, obviously, is, well, I really want everybody to be able to walk on water. That's not going to happen. But if they can demonstrate those sets of characteristics, then the professional skills development we can work on, because we know they've got the foundations of them as a person that will help us to develop their professional skills.
So before we move on to that professional development, Barbara, maybe we can have a look at the results of that poll question. So again, 100%. So younger new entrants in the industry expect a better work-life balance. I think everybody agrees. And there's no silver bullet here. It's really hard to do that. It's really hard to achieve as a business operator.
As a business
providing
operator,
that work-life balance, that's not a simple thing to achieve.
Which comes back to my point about, this is why you really have to think about the nature of your business model. You have to think about the nature of when you operate, how you operate, and so on. And we've got some interesting examples over here of businesses, especially in the restaurant sector, who are saying, I don't open anymore from Sunday lunchtime through till Wednesday night. Because I haven't got the staff available. So I'm only going to deliver to the quality with the resource I've got available, which reduces my opening hours. Now that's an issue financially, but then on the other hand, they're probably reducing their cost base at the same time. But so it's about, how do you achieve that balance in terms of the operational structure of your business and the resources that you've got available to you.
So final poll question here. Education and training will have to change to keep pace with the changes in the industry. So Barbara, if you can pop that one up. But before we get into the results, how do you see, Peter, how do you see the significant turnover has impacted both the line and leadership training?
Well, there is a greater requirement for line and leadership training, because obviously you've got a much greater turnover of people. If you've got a stable workforce, then the training needs actually are in themselves fairly stable. You're just looking to support them through continuous professional development. If you've got a very high turnover of labour force or leaving at one end, then you've got to make a significant investment in training and education at the bottom end. Now, unless you invest that money up front, and I appreciate how hard that is, and unless there is an investment, and the investment is mostly in time. And I would also argue that the training never stops. A lot of it happens on the job, but it needs to be properly mentored, supervised, facilitated. It can't just be assumed that oh, well, that's all right. He's working next to Nelly. Nelly will show him everything he needs to know. You need to make sure Nelly knows what the hell she's doing in the first place before you start that approach. And the other is it's about encouraging them. It's always about getting them to observe what's going on around them, to constantly be asking the questions and to think about what they're doing, not just to treat it as a routine, repetitious activity. So some of it in that education training is actually encouraging them to think about themselves, what they're doing and when they're doing it, how they're doing it. And that's a sort of slightly different mindset from the one of saying, okay, we clear from the left, well, we serve from the right, clear from the left. We always place the things in this way and so on, which becomes, that's a rote exercise. We want to move on from rote learning to much more learner engagement in the business activity.
So let's have a look at the results then. 94% of respondents believe that education and training needs to change. So the implications, can you talk us through these?
Well, I think the most important ones there are actually that industry at the moment values professional recognition. In other words, demonstrable recognition from the industry itself that an individual is meeting the professional standards that the industry expects compared to academic qualifications. And over time, we've seen a sort of what is often referred to as an academic drift that's moved further away from the vocational and professional to become much more academic. So there is a view in the industry, I'd rather have somebody that I can recognize and see what they've achieved professionally than saying, okay, they come with a master's degree or an MBA. Well, so what? All that's showing me is that they can think. These other people can think as well. What I want them, what I need is something which gives that professional recognition. And that's a different approach, and that's a different role for HFTP and many of the organizations that we've been dealing with that can provide that level of education, professional development, and recognition. Because the recognition is much more accepted by the industry overall than somebody coming along with a whole raft of academic qualifications, but no demonstrable ability to do a job.
Yeah, for sure. I think that pretty much sums it up. And there's a lot more detail in this area too. So here's a little bit of that detail. Can you talk us through this?
Yes, this is about professional development needs. And you'll notice here that there's a view, yes, it should be available to everybody. It should be an essential part of every single employment opportunity. So you're saying to somebody when they come into you, we're going to offer you this professional development because it's an essential part of retaining them. If you're prepared to invest in them, then they're much more likely to invest in you. It's obviously essential in career development for any workforce, especially leadership training. And we asked the specific question about leadership training, and we got some interesting responses there that leadership training was considered to be important and very important, or less so for new entrants, but for every other job classification, category, positioning in the industry. So they're looking for leaders, not just at the top, the general managers, the directors, senior executives. We're looking for leadership ability to be enhanced and developed throughout the whole structure, because you need people to be able to be self-starters, self-thinkers. And in order to do that, they often have to have that leadership ability and have some leadership training and education to help to facilitate the innate characteristics they may already have. The other thing, which is you can see quite starkly there, is that all of that career development and professional development they're saying should be much more associated with this professional recognition idea than it would necessarily be with academic qualifications.
So we need continuous professional development at all levels of the industry, available to everybody, that also comes with that professional recognition.
That's correct.
So Barbara, moving on to the results of the poll 4, how do they compare?
Rob, oh, we nearly done it again.
So yeah, education and training will have to change to keep pace with the changes in the industry. I think we started this conversation with those significant changes in the industry. And those changes are driving changes in workforce and changes in training and education too, to deliver and to keep pace. So if you have any additional questions, if you can please post them now. We have a few minutes at the end to answer them and respond to them. But summing up the views of the industry on undoubtedly the toughest challenge that hoteliers and hospitality professionals are facing today, the skill shortage, we've got some key takeaways. So we thought we'd try and condense this into 5 points that you can take away and make a difference in your organizations. Peter, can you talk through those takeaways, please?
Yeah, sure. In fact, I'll use an example for the first one now, if I may. So this morning there was one of the European guides was published, and the restaurant that was at the top of the European guide last year is not now in the top 100.
Wow.
And so, and the reason for that is customer service and good value. So the one that was there now, it doesn't feature anywhere in the latest edition. Well, it doesn't feature in the top 100 of the guide. Now, what we're beginning to see is that people are much more discriminating now. There is less disposable income. They want to spend the money where they know they're going to get good value and the customer service is going to meet their expectations. So that's some of the things which are actually driving consumer behavior at the moment. That's absolutely what they're looking for. So, and there are a number of those. I won't say they happen daily, but I'm aware of enough of that happening with this anecdotal evidence coming up from the industry, which is absolutely supporting the findings from our survey. Staffing, we know, is the major challenge, and that doesn't seem to matter where you are in the world. That is the issue. I can drive wherever I drive. I can see in restaurant windows signage outside all saying staff wanted. You know, incredible challenges that we're all facing here, and there is no one size fits all solution. And throwing money at the problem is not necessarily a short-term answer either, because you then end up with an escalating upward spiral. And one or two areas, and hoteliers associations have sort of come up with floors on there, and they've agreed on the rates that they're going to offer to stop people moving for an extra, $1 an hour over there compared to what I was getting over here. So we know that there is this major challenge there, and operationally we've got to fix it, but also at the same time we've also got to look at what we're offering. What is it that we're offering? How can we make it as attractive as possible? How can we promote the industry as an attractive career aspiration for younger individuals? Technology can help, as we've said, but it's not a substitute for guest service. You can use it in support of guest service, but don't try and use it purely and simply as a substitute for it, because again, customer service and value is paramount. People want that people-to-people interaction. If I'm paying a premium price for that, I don't expect to have to just deal with a machine.
I think technology, sorry to interrupt, Peter, technology is an extension of your service provision as well. If the technology is there for ordering, they also expect that the same level of efficiency is going to be available in your people too. So
absolutely
we've seen
right.
some
Otherwise you end
service failures there too. So
yeah, you can get easy failures there, and you end up with dissonance. You say, well, hang on a minute, that part of it worked brilliantly, but this bit over here was hopeless. So I'm not going to come back here again. Now, sometimes that might be the technology that fails as opposed to the people that fail. But people are more forgiving if the technology fails because they think somebody pulled the plug out compared to a people failure. But, you've got to get that balance right, haven't you? And I think we've gone on enough about education and training and not meeting the needs to change. And this whole issue about aspirational, flexible, professional career package.
Great, thank you, Peter. So we now have a few minutes to respond to some of the questions you've been entering. Maybe Brittany, could you summarize those for us, please?
Absolutely. I'll read one of the first ones. It was posted by Art. Universities in many areas of US are seeing significant deadlines in HRM program, student new admissions, and withdrawals. Is that trend happening in other areas of the world? And what are your thoughts on how to reverse these trends, as universities are a key part of future employees and leaders in our industry?
Yeah,
That's a
it
fantastic
is happening worldwide. It's not just a US phenomena. It's certainly happening almost everywhere. That the universities are not attracting the individuals into those types of courses that they may have done in the past. Now, of course, that then gets into a declining spiral as well, because if the university is not recruiting, then they have a tendency to marginalize the nature of those programs. They'll invest in a different program, so they reduce the supply on that side as well. So you're into a difficult situation if you're not careful. The only way I can suggest that you need to work is working with the university to try and ensure that that industry education partnership is recognizing what the career offer is, because when the university is trying to recruit to its courses, it's not just recruiting to say we're going to give you this over 3 years. It's recruiting to say we are going to help to prepare you for this industry, for this career. So that industry and that career has to be an integral part of that recruitment process at the beginning of the pipeline, not leave it until the end, which is what we've always traditionally done. We do the graduate milk rounds. We go around and put our hoardings up and say, hey, come on, guys, come and work for me. I can do this. We need to do that at the beginning of the process now, not at the end.
Awesome. And another question for y'all from Wolfgang is, did you see a difference in responses based on the hotel category? i.e., is there a difference between a simple B&B or a luxury palace hotel?
No.
Sure. Yeah, that was quite evident, and something we went searching for too, to see if there was a certain end of the market, if the B&Bs were finding it easier because they're community based, they're local, they know the people in their area. But we went searching for differences and not only differences within the sector globally, but differences within sectors regionally as well. And as Peter succinctly put it, we didn't find any differences. Everyone's going through exactly the same challenges.
I think it's worth picking up just quickly, very quickly, on a point that Matthew's made about the community issues and the small and medium enterprises and the small enterprises, if they're more community based. And that was something that we predicted in the report, post-COVID hospitality industry report that we did, was that those are actually more likely to be able to weather, they're more resilient to weather significant external factors and impacts, but only if certain characteristics are in place. They're still suffering from the same issues and the same problems, but they may be more resilient. And the ones at the top with very deep pockets, they always have a tendency to be quite resilient, but they also have to, and they have probably the money to change, even if the will is not always there in the same way. You often find the smaller businesses are more resilient, more in tune with the customer, and able to change more flexibly and quicker. So even though they're suffering from the same problems, they tend to be more resilient and more likely to be in a position to survive.
I think the sector of the industry that's finding it toughest is the SMEs. Those that aren't big enough to have the deep pockets to be able to invest in, in-house programs and that training with professional recognition, and also are too big to be able to do it on the job, face to face in that community environment. So, those chains that sit in the SME sector of the market, they're really the ones that are finding it tough. Yeah,
and it's in that sector that we're beginning to notice that they're reducing their number of outlets. So if they've got 7 or more out, or they've got more than say 7 or 8 outlets somewhere within, not necessarily within a local area, but generally, they're actually closing some of those. We had some recorded yesterday. One of the big restaurant groups in the UK, D&D, 45 restaurants they're probably slightly, they're at the cusp between 250 and probably 1,000 staff. They closed 6 on Monday, 6 restaurants on Monday. No intention of reopening them. And Byron Hamburgers reported today they're closing something like 20% of their outlets.
And then we have 2 more questions, and I want to make sure we have time to answer both. The first one is from Wendy. It was mentioned that greater costs will need to be spent on recruitment. Do they have any statistics on how much more is going to need to be spent?
No, but my answer would be as much as you can possibly afford. Don't skimp on recruitment and training. Really invest, because you're investing in the future by doing that. And you really can't afford to skimp on that process. I wouldn't necessarily say use agencies or whatever, but if you've an allocated budget and you say my recruitment budget for this year is, I don't know, 5%, really seriously think about how much you can afford to invest in recruitment and all the associated training and professional development that's associated with it. The more you can invest up front, the better the longer term outcome's going to be.
And the final question by Anne. Do you feel for front of the house staff, if we were to go to a salaried rather than minimum wage and tips, that would keep talented staff and they would be able to count on a steady check every week and not deal with the flow of slow and high covers at any given time, stop the fluctuations possibly?
Yep, I would agree with that. Certainly you find in Europe, of course, it's a completely different employment model than it is necessarily in the US. So yes, we still have people on what would be considered to be minimum wage, but often now with more flexible, you're having to come up with more flexible contracts. People are looking for the security of knowing what the income stream is going to be and not saying reliant on the fluctuations within the business. And what you're going to get from that is you're going to get much more loyalty, and because they can see that you're investing in them. So again, it comes back to my point about having to change the nature of the business model to respond to the factors that are facing the industry at the moment.
I think also to add to what Peter's just said, in the past, people have looked to work for a brand. They wanted, to associate their career with a major brand. Then it moved to working for an individual. They were looking for leaders to work for. Now they're adding themselves to that and saying, what's in it for me? And a salary that gives them that security, as Peter mentioned, but also that professional development packaged in with that is going to give them that vision and that future that they're looking for their personal career development. So they're getting into career's a big part of my life. What's in it for me?
Absolutely. Yeah. Interesting.
All right.
Not easy. I don't think we're pretending that any of this is easy, but at least what we're doing and what we're trying to do is raise the issue so people can have the opportunity to think about them and what can they do about them and how can they take some of these ideas and make them work within their own business.
For sure. So that concludes our presentation today. I hope you found it of value. I've certainly really enjoyed our discussions as always, Peter. And
thank you
very much for sharing your insights into the results of the survey.
No, thank you. I hope people will take away from it what they want to take away from it. And at least, if nothing else, we've made people think about what's going on in the industry at the moment. And therefore, if you think about it, then you're in a much stronger position of actually trying to determine your futures. And good luck.
Reassurance that the challenges you're facing, you're not alone.
They're not unique. They're not unique to you.
They're certainly, they're global in all sectors of the industry. So if you'd like a copy of the report, then send me an email. My email address is there, or connect on LinkedIn. And thanks very much for joining us. I'll hand back to Brittany to explain how you can claim your CPD points now. So back to you, Brittany.
Great. Thank you both again for the expert discussion today. I just want to wrap up with a few last minute comments. eHotelier offers additional online resources via the learning platform, supporting the continuous professional development of current and aspiring hotel leaders. As Matthew mentioned, a copy of the slide deck will be available, so be sure to jot down his email address. Next Wednesday, we are holding an HFTP Hangout on the questions colleagues and customers have of, can I trust this person? Registration is open now, and we will be offering CPE credits ethics for this Hangout. If you are collecting continuing education credit today, please note that you will need to self-report your credit for this webinar through the certification tracking spreadsheet, which can be found at the bottom of the HFTP webinar webpage. In addition, an email with the CPE credit certification information will be sent within 24 hours. Please save this email for your records. And this concludes today's broadcast, and we appreciate everyone who attended today. And thank you again, Peter and Matthew. It's a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you. Cheers.